Okay, before we start, I just want to say that the numbers that you saw in the thumbnail, they are not clickbait. See? 1500% crit chance, boom, 20,000 HP, we can never die, room nuke, infinite energy, and the best thing is, this is no bug. These are all fully intentional game mechanics. Like, Nidus is hands down one of the most broken Warframes now. So yeah, you know the drill. Big shoutouts to all the generous channel members, and now let's check out this red crit madness. First things first, let's start talking about Nidus abilities, where we start out with the passive. And let me tell you, with Nidus there is quite a lot going on here. First of all, Nidus has different rank up bonuses compared to other Warframes. What that means is that at rank 30, we're gonna have some nice traits like more ability strength and this is pretty neat, a constant health regeneration of what the wiki says is 15 health per second. I'm not sure if this one has already been updated after the update, but in the dev workshop, the developer said that they doubled the innate health regen. So it might be that it's also 30 health per second now. The main mechanic here when it comes to Nidus' passive though, we see that in the bottom right corner of our screen. This counter right here represents our mutation stacks, a unique mechanic on Nidus that is very important for all the other abilities in his kit. You increase and decrease these mutation stacks by using your 4 main abilities, and we're gonna get into that as we talk about them. All I want to say here is that the mutation stacks are capped at a maximum of 200 by default. However though, one thing that I can already say about these stacks is that they kinda sorta grant you invincibility. See, as part of Nidus' passive, whenever you take fatal damage and you have at least 15 mutation stacks left, then instead of dying, you will just sacrifice 15 mutation stacks, become invulnerable for 5 seconds, and then you will have half of your health restored. This is a very neat mechanic because, as you're gonna see in just a minute, building up these mutation stacks is very darn easy, and this effectively allows you to stay up constantly even at very high enemy levels. Now, for Nidus, the passive ability itself already has an augment, and this one is called Abundant Mutation. What it does is, instead of having a maximum of 200 mutation stacks, it increases that to a maximum of 500. These additional mutation stacks then will make other parts of your kit a bit stronger. However, as a trade-off, it also puts a 30-second cooldown onto the Undying mechanic that we just mentioned. If you ask me, in the past Abundant Mutation was pretty neat, but with the higher initial cap of 200 now post-rework, I kind of feel increasing that isn't really all that necessary anymore, and putting this 30-second cooldown onto the Undying thing, the one thing that will literally keep us alive no matter the enemy level, that is a trade-off that I would personally just rather not take. Ability number 1 goes by the name Virulence, I don't really know. Let's just call it Virulence, alright? So, Virulence is a very important ability for Nidus. When you cast it, what happens is Nidus will stomp on the ground and then shoot out a carpet of infested goop that will just then move out in a straight line. Every enemy you hit with this goop carpet will then contribute to your mutation stack counter. This is actually the main tool that most Nidus players use to increase their mutation stack counter quickly. In the past, only the initial cast on hit would give you mutation stacks. However, post-rework now, the goop carpet lingers around a little bit longer, dealing damage over time, which in turn will then also increase your mutation stacks further with every DOT instance. Overall, this is a great QOL change. However, if your only goal is to get your mutation stacks up as quickly as possible, then spam casting is still that little bit faster. In addition to increasing your mutation stacks, the first ability also though is very good to regenerate energy. In fact, it is the tool that will literally give us infinite energy all the time. The way this works is that, for every enemy you hit with the goop carpet on your initial cast, you will restore 25% of the energy that you consumed for the initial cast. In other words, if you manage to hit 5 or more enemies with a cast, you will regenerate more energy than you spend to cast the ability. What that also means though is that negative ability efficiency is actually nothing to worry about on Nidus. Remember what I said? You regenerate 25% of the energy that you spent on the cast. This means with low efficiency, therefore higher energy spent, you also regenerate proportionally more. As for the damage of the ability itself, it scales with the amount of mutation stacks that you have as well as ability strength, and if you have your mutation stacks full, then it is able to deal some impressive numbers, but overall I wouldn't necessarily build towards that use case. Now, about Virulence, there are a couple more interactions mentioned in the wiki, but they're not going to be important for today's build, so I'm going to take the liberty to just skip over them for now. What we're not going to skip over though would be the augment Teeming Virulence. With this one, when you hit 4 or more enemies with a cast, you will give your primary weapon a big fat crit buff. This buff works like a normal crit chance mod, so it's not multiplicative or anything. However, it does scale with ability strength. And what that means is, with high ability strength, you are going to get some ridiculous red crit potential. That is, by the way, also what you saw in the intro. Ability number 2 is called Larva, and this one, oh boy, this one got, in my opinion, the biggest glow up with the rework. When you cast the ability, you're going to create an infested blob at the position that you're currently aiming at. This blob then will shoot out tentacles and rapidly pull in all enemies in its AoE. If you then go and take out the enemies in the larva blob, this further increases your mutation stacks. However, the main use of this ability is of course to just group up the enemies, and it's pretty good at that, has a decent range, and it pulls them in very quickly. Now, in the past, Larva was not recastable, which was a huge pain in the butt. This though has now been changed because Larva is now recastable by default. This saves the ability so much. There is also an augment called Lava Burst, and in the past this one was basically mandatory because it allows you to press the ability button again to blow up the blob manually, and before the update that would then allow us to basically have Larva be recastable. With the rework now, we don't have to use this as a mandatory augment anymore, which is really nice and can open up some build space. However, the augment itself got a retouch too. Where beforehand, this larva explosion would just deal a bit of toxin, nothing to write home about, now it is going to inflict 1 toxin proc on every enemy caught in larva per enemy caught in larva. So if we group up 20 enemies with larva and then blow it up, then each of those 20 enemies will get 20 toxin procs. This is actually very darn strong, and we're also going to use that for our nuking build later down the line. Skill number 3 goes by the name Parasitic Link, and this one hasn't changed all too much, but it did change in one very impactful way. Let's check it out. First of all, as you can also see right here, the wiki entry for this ability is huge. And for time's sake, I'm not going to go into every single detail and interaction with this one, but I will focus on only what is important for today's video. You can cast this ability at an enemy or at an ally. Whoever you cast it on, it will then create an infested link to that specific entity. When you link to an enemy, then you will create a damage redirection that scales with ability strength and caps out at a maximum of 90%. This way then, 90% of the damage that you would actually take is going to be redirected to that enemy. As an additional treat, it would also prevent knockdown and stagger effects. In the past, this is what we usually went for to become crazy survivable. But, as we're going to see in the build section, it's no longer necessary. The main change with Parasitic Link with the update though is that now linking to an ally not only includes other players, but also free moving companions. So if you have a Kubro, a Kavad, a Vulpaphyla, whatever, you can now cast that link onto your companion. The reason why this is so good is that the buffs that you get from linking to your ally are actually much better. Here, you will gain a weapon damage bonus, 25% by default, plus an ability strength bonus of 25% as well. The reason why this buff is so incredibly strong is that it scales with ability strength, so the higher your strength, the bigger the bonus, but the bonus is also multiplicative. Both the weapon damage, which is multiplicative to whatever you have modded on your weapon, as well as the ability strength bonus. So, in other words, if you have 400% ability strength on your Nidus, that would mean the ability strength bonus from Parasitic Link is not going to be 25%, but 100%, and these 100% are multiplicative, increasing your 400% strength to 800%. 800% ability strength. Yes, that is possible. There's literally no reason not to have this up constantly. Now, Parasitic Link also has an augment. Nidus has a lot of augments, and this one is called Parasitic Vitality. One of the, in my opinion, absolutely mandatory mods on every high-level Nidus build. What Parasitic Vitality does is, whenever the Parasitic Link is up, no matter if to an ally or to an enemy, you will increase your maximum health by 4% per mutation stack, scaling with ability strength. If you have the maximum of 200 stacks plus a whole bunch of ability strength, this is how you get you tens of thousands of maximum HP. You might say, mandatory augment kind of always, not a great design decision. However, this mod is technically not really an augment. Instead, it is a vitality mod, because it replaces other types of vitality mods. And given the fact that you would have used vitality on Nidus anyway, you don't really lose a mod slot through this quote-unquote mandatory augment. It's just a different form of vitality. And last but definitely not least, we have his fourth ability, Ravenous. This one has two sides to it. First of all, when you cast it, you will create a big AoE-infested area on the ground, in which you and allies, when you stand in it, you will regenerate a bunch of health per second. Previously, this carpet had a fixed radius, but now after the update it does scale with ability range, giving you the ability to make it much larger. The second thing that it does is, it continuously spawns little maggots over time. These maggots will then go and attack nearby enemies, and as you can see in the background right here, there is quite a lot to it. The biggest difference though now is that previously those maggots didn't scale with anything and were basically completely useless. However, now they properly count as summons, which means they benefit from Summoner's Wrath, Arcane Kamisado, Theorem Infection, as well as Nourish. This makes them quite a bit more useful. Now, when it comes to Ravenous as a whole, I have a little bit of an issue. On the one hand, the ability is definitely very capable, has a lot of heal, and it has the maggots and they now properly scale. It's all nice and well. If you want to go and use it, absolutely no problem. However, as we're going to see later in the build section, the entire first part of this ability, the healing part, that is not even going to be necessary anymore at all at higher level play. And given how good the other three abilities are, I feel that if you want to use a Helminth ability, then Ravenous, just like pre-update, remains as the most attractive contender. Ravenous also has an augment called Insatiable, and this one basically makes it that he will continuously regenerate more mutation stacks over time. It's definitely not a bad augment, and if you use Ravenous in your build, you might as well use it if you have the space, but I personally think it's not as necessary as some of the others. But as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be super nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. So thank you so much for your support. So much for his abilities. Before we get into the builds themselves though, I first want to talk about survivability, because with the reworked Nidus, this is actually a very interesting topic because it works differently for him than for any other Warframe in the game. Let me explain. For all of our builds in today's video, we're going to make use of Arcane Persistence to keep Nidus alive. This arcane makes it that whenever you have 700 or more armor, your health loss will be limited to at max 500 per second. So no matter how much incoming damage there is, you will never ever lose more than 500 HP per second. If we now think back to the augment for our third ability, Parasitic Vitality, which gives us the 20,000+ HP, that becomes a very strong combination. Because with 20,000 health and a health loss that is limited to 500 per second, that means that even in the worst case scenario, it would take enemies 40 seconds straight to get us down to 0 HP. On other health tanks, like for example Inaros now, we would usually go and combine Arcane Persistence with Arcane Grace. Arcane Grace heals 6% of your maximum health per second, and if your maximum health is over 8,333, that means it will start healing more HP per second than the 500 that you can lose. This way you become essentially completely invincible. However though, even though Nidus is way above 8,333 HP, we're actually not going to use Arcane Grace. Why is that? Because of his passive. Remember, when you have at least 15 mutation stacks, which is like nothing, then when you go down to 0 HP, you're just not going to die, but instead you lose 15 stacks and you're going to come back with half of your maximum HP. So yeah, you can see where that goes. If our maximum HP is so ridiculously high, we don't even need to heal the lost HP back up. It takes so long for the enemies to kill us that it is perfectly fine to die once every 2-3 minutes or so. These 15 stacks that you lose, you get that back with like 1 or 2 casts of your first ability. This way, Arcane Persistence is literally the only defense tool we'll ever need. We don't need to allocate any more build space towards Arcane Grace or any healing ability or whatever. It all doesn't matter. However though, with that being said now, let's jump right into the builds, starting out with an overview of our Helminth abilities. And for this one, I want to keep it pretty simple. Nidus is a very flexible frame and can be used in many different scenarios. So if you have any preferences, then totally go and use whatever you like. For the sake of today, I want to talk about 2 though in specific, which would be, of course, the universal make damage bigger button called Roar, which, you know, it is raw, I don't need to explain it, right? More universal faction damage to weapons as well as abilities at the same time. It is really good, and we're going to use it on our Nuke build. And then secondly, and this is sort of in my opinion a secret tip on Nidus, that would be Open Him Eyes from Jade. Kind of funny because it also is thematic for the new update in a way. This one shines a light cone in front of you in which enemies will be slowed and lose part of their defenses per second. The quote-unquote problem with Open Him Eyes is that the defense reduction is only 10% at base, meaning you would have to have 1000% ability strength to strip away enemy armor in just a second. However though, my dear friends, Nidus in comparison to other Warframes has a little bit of a very broken high ability strength ceiling, so Open Him Eyes becomes incredibly powerful on him. The much bigger question with the Helminth though is, which of your 4 abilities will you replace? And for this one, it comes down to personal preference, but I would see there to be 2 different candidates. Larva on the one hand, if you feel like your build just doesn't need the grouping, and then Ravenous, which is my personal favorite. Given the fact that the main selling point of this ability is that it heals a whole lot and very fast, you can see why it is not so important for our builds anymore. We just talked about why exactly healing isn't even needed on Nidus in 2026. This is why I personally chose to subsume over Ravenous in all my builds. However, whoever says Helminth abilities also needs to say Archon Shards, and for these ones, I actually have a relatively directed approach for Nidus. First of all, what I do is I use 2 blue ones for more maximum energy. If you wanted to, you could also invest more and go for the Tauforged ones. Reason for that is that this way I don't need to use a flow mod on my build. You might now say that a total of 290 energy is really not all that much, but remember, with Nidus we basically have infinite energy because we regenerate it all the time with every cast of our first ability. Now, for the green Archon Shards, I first thought that if we use Archon Continuity in combination with the Larva Burst Augment that inflicts Toxin, then each and every one of these tons of Toxin procs could be turned into a Corrosive proc. This way, the 2 green shards would allow us to fully armor strip everybody in the larva. Turns out though that in practice, unfortunately, no matter how many Toxin procs you inflict, you only get 1 Corrosive. On my build, I still use Archon Continuity because 1 Corrosive proc is better than none at all. However though, I would be very happy if DE could maybe look into these interactions at some point in the future. However, if you personally don't like the idea of doing that, then these 2 green shards here would be flex slots. You could use it for something like more ability casting speed, for example, which on Nidus is definitely not a bad idea. And then lastly, and this is very, very important, I use 1 Tauforged blue shard, has to be Tauforged, for plus 225 armor. This way, we can get our total armor with the builds that we're going to show later to 1400. 1400 armor then is of course very important for the survivability method that we previously talked about. Remember, Arcane Persistence, if you have more than 700 armor, your health loss is limited to 500 per second. Problem is, if you eat a heat proc, and believe me, you eat heat procs all the time in Warframe, then that will halve your maximum armor. Meaning, if you have less than 1400 armor, a heat proc would drop you under 700, which will then instantly deactivate the effect of the arcane, allowing your health to basically plummet in freefall. That is very, very important, especially for higher level content where you really need this limitation of 500 health loss per second. And with this one shard in combination with the builds, we're gonna get to 1400, and that is very important. But now, let's finally get into the modding itself. And here, I want to start out with the Steel Path Red Crit Gunrunner build. This one is incredibly strong, but not only are we going to take a look at the Nidus mods, but also into the synergy with our weapons as well as our companion. So, stay tuned for that. First of all though, this is what our Nidus looks like. Aura as well as Exodus mod slot are completely open to your personal preference. I like growing power on a Gunrunner build because we can basically keep it up constantly. Power drift though, that is not really necessary. If you want to replace it with anything else, then do your worst. For the survivability, as we previously explained, we go with Arcane Persistence and no healing ability whatsoever. Of course though, in order to get all the health in the world that we need, we of course need to combine it with Parasitic Vitality, which at the maximum amount of stacks will give us 20,000+ health and you can never die. To make sure that we have the 1400 armor so that this never switches off, we go with Double Umbral with Fiber as well as Intensify and the previously mentioned Tau-Forged Blue Archon Shard, and that together will then get us to over 1400. I'm not 100% sure right now. I'm using Nidus Prime. Maybe the normal Nidus has less base armor and it might not actually reach the 1400, in which case you might have to allocate more Blue Archon Shards. Not 100% sure now. The rest of the build then focuses on a whole bunch of ability strength in the form of Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Umbral Intensify, as well as Arcane Bellicose. This one is actually tailor-made for Nidus because, we're gonna have so much health, this one is gonna be at maximum all the time. As our Helminth subsume on this build, we're going to use Open Eyes. We talked about it in the Helminth section earlier, but this one is very, very cool because it not only slows enemies in front of you, it also melts away their armor. If we combine that with a Larva that groups enemies into a blob in front of us, you can see that we have a very, very strong combination. That is, by the way, also why I use Overextended to increase my ability range. Yes, it does cost me a bunch of strength and it kind of sort of hurts, but the range is really appreciated. Larva now has the 23 meter radius and Open Eyes goes to 38 meters. It is more than enough. Lastly, in order to get all the nice and juicy red crits onto our weapon, we use Teeming Virulence. This one gives us 200% crit chance if we manage to hit at least 4 enemies with one cast of our first ability, and that shouldn't be all too difficult. But the kicker is that these 200%, they scale with ability strength. So with the 300 that we're rocking right now, we're looking at 600% already. However though, 600%, like you can see right here, is not 1500 like shown in the thumbnail. So how do we reach that? Well, the key here is using Parasitic Link on our companion. This one gives us an ability strength, you can also see it in the top right corner, 75%, whenever we link ourselves to an ally. This is very cool because, as we also previously mentioned, this ability strength increase of 75% is multiplicative. In other words, we now don't have 600% crit chance, but 1230. That is because of the multiplicative ability strength increase, which basically doubles the crit rate now on this skill. However, we can go much higher with that. If we use our weapon synergy, then we can go and cast our Grimoire for another 60% strength buff. Don't worry, we're going to explain that in just a second. And if we then cast the Parasitic Link, it's going to snapshot this additional ability strength. And you can also now see in the top right corner, we're sitting at 109% multiplicative ability strength buff now from the Parasitic Link. And if we then use Virulence, we now have 1700% crit chance. You can see it right here. Boom, the fat level 50 bazillion red crits. It is absolutely insane. So yeah, let's take a look at the rest of the loadout, which makes all of this possible. First of all, we go with any type of free running companion. For example, this Panzerwolperpfeiler right here. And there we go, there's the mod stream. The build here, all in all, doesn't really matter all too much. I personally just chose a Panzerwolperpfeiler for the viral priming. You can copy it, you can swap the mods as you see fit. That is not really the key aspect here. What is cool though is the Grimoire in the secondary slot. This right here is very important because of Vome Invocation. If we fire our alt fire, this can give us up to 60% more ability strength based on how many enemies we hit with this. The cool thing here though is that whenever we fire the alt fire to activate Vome Invocation, this will automatically also trigger Growing Power because it will trigger status effects, and therefore we're technically getting 85% strength buff in total. And by the way, this is not only very good for the crit buff, but also for Orphan MIs, because the multiplicative ability strength increase applies to the armor strip from Orphan MIs as well. Remember, 10% at base per second? Well, take a look at this now. The enemy armor just melts away in a split second. It is unreal. By the time the enemies are grouped up by Larva in front of us, they already don't have armor anymore. Also here, just for completion's sake, this right here is the blast build that I use on my Burst on Prime Incarnon, and these are the evolutions. I'm not going to explain it here because I already have a full guide on the Burst on my channel. You can check it out if you like. But this gun build is of course not the only thing today. We also have a nice little nuke build using our second ability. So let's also take a look at that. First of all, why don't I just show you the performance of this in practice? What this build is supposed to do is very straightforward. You cast Larva, and then it groups up the enemies, and when you use Lava Burst, the augment, it blows them up and they just evaporate in a split second. These were Steel Path level 180 heavy gunners, by the way. So let's take a look at it. First of all, the survivability is essentially the same. Arcane Persistence, no defense whatsoever, and 1400 armor. That's all we need. For the rest of the build, we too focus on a whole bunch of ability strength, because more strength means just more big numbers, but the kicker here is that we focus on our second ability. This one needs the Larva Burst augment, which allows you to manually detonate the blob in which the enemies are, and when you do that, every enemy in the blob will be inflicted with 1 toxin proc for every other enemy in the blob. So if we group up the 20 enemies in the simulacrum, then each and every one of them will get 20 toxin procs on them. And that is even further amplified by our subsume ability, which is Roar. Roar, as you probably know, is a universal faction damage bonus, which means it double dips on the damage over time procs from the toxin of Larva. And yes, also here, we're gonna make use of the multiplicative ability strength increase that we get from Parasitic Link, which will get our Roar to a total of like 180, maybe even 200% more faction damage. It is insane. And now, also check out my full guide on the brand new Warframe, Sirius, and Orion. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nas Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Underkaneo 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantares, Petrosader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awendai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin8802, Gabriel, Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, Argentad, GE Schnoz, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, good loot.